I was standing at the kitchen counter, slicing tomatoes for a salad neither of us would end up eating, when my husband of 35 years told me I had never contributed anything to our marriage. He didn't shout it. That was the strange part. Robert had never been a shouter, not in 35 years, not once. He said it the way he said most things, calmly, reasonably, like a man reading a weather report. "You're just a housewife, Linda. You've never really contributed to what we built." "I built the business. I built our life. You just managed the house." I set the knife down very carefully because my hands had started to shake, and I did not want him to see that. We were 3 weeks into what Robert called a rough patch, and what I had privately started calling something else entirely. The slow, cold unraveling of a marriage neither of us had the energy or the honesty to name out loud. He'd been distant for months, working later, taking calls in the garage with the door shut, the particular kind of distance that women married a long time learn to recognize even when they don't want to. That afternoon, I had finally asked him directly. Not accusingly, just tired, 35 years tired, standing in the kitchen we'd renovated twice, in the house we'd bought when Robert's hardware business was still just a single storefront and a dream. "Are you happy, Robert?" I'd asked. "Because I don't think I am. Not anymore." He'd looked at me for a long moment, and then said the thing about my never contributing, and something in me, something that had been quietly, patiently waiting for 35 years, simply stopped waiting. I want to explain, before I go further, exactly what those 35 years had actually contained, because Robert's version of our history had apparently, somewhere along the way, edited me almost entirely out of it. Looked like Robert, and I married when I was 23, fresh out of a business degree I'd earned working nights at a diner to pay my own tuition, because my parents hadn't believed college was a wise investment for a daughter. Robert had just opened Whitfield Hardware, a single storefront in a strip mall, funded by a small loan and an enormous amount of nerve. For the first 8 years, I worked the register. Not as a hobby, not as helping out, as the person who did the bookkeeping, managed inventory, handled every vendor negotiation, because Robert, brilliant as he was at reading a market and sensing an opportunity, was terrible with numbers and worse with paperwork. I built the accounting system that store ran on for a decade. I negotiated our first bulk supplier contract, the one that cut our costs by nearly a third and let us open our second location. I did all of this while pregnant with our first son, working right up until 2 weeks before he was born, and back at the register 6 weeks after. When our second child came, and then our third, I stepped back from the daily register work, not because Robert asked me to, but because someone needed to raise 3 children, and in the arrangement we'd made together quietly, without ever really discussing it as a decision, that someone was me. But I never stopped being involved. I did the books from home for another 6 years. I sat in on every major expansion decision. When Robert wanted to open the third location, I was the one who ran the numbers and told him, correctly, that the location he'd fallen in love with wouldn't turn a profit for at least 4 years, and that he should look 2 miles east instead. He did. It was profitable within 18 months. I raised 3 children essentially alone during the years. The business expanded from 3 locations to 11, because Robert traveled constantly during that period, chasing suppliers and scouting sites, and doing all the things a growing regional hardware chain requires a founder to do. I managed every school event, every doctor's appointment, every crisis, every 2 a.m. fever, while also managing our household's finances, our investments, our tax planning, because Robert trusted me with money in a way he never quite managed to trust himself. I hosted every client dinner. I remembered every business partner's spouse's name, every anniversary, every small detail that made Robert look, to the outside world, like a thoughtful, attentive man of business, when in reality it was very often me, quietly, behind the scenes, keeping the machinery of both our household and his professional reputation running. I was never on the payroll. That detail matters more than I understood at the time. Robert had, decades earlier, suggested it would be simpler for tax purposes if I wasn't a formal employee or officer of the company, and I, 26 years old, trusting, in love, unaware of how significant that decision would one day become, had agreed without a second thought. So when Robert stood in our kitchen and said I'd never contributed, what he was really saying, whether he understood it or not, was, There's no paper trail proving otherwise, and I've decided to act like that means it never happened. I didn't respond to him that day in the kitchen. I picked the knife back up, finished slicing the tomatoes, and put the salad in the refrigerator, because some part of me needed my hands to do something ordinary while the rest of me processed what had just been said. 2 days later, Robert told me he wanted a divorce. He'd apparently been planning it for some time. There was, it turned out, a woman named Denise, a regional manager at one of the newer store locations, 22 years younger than me, and Robert had reached the particular stage of a long, quiet affair where a man convinces himself that ending his marriage is not cruelty, but simply, finally, honesty. He told me all of this with the same calm, reasonable tone he'd used in the kitchen. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. He had, he said, a fair proposal, the house, a modest settlement, and his position that the business itself, now worth an estimated $42 million across its 11 locations, was entirely his, built through his vision and his labor, and that I should be grateful for what he was offering rather than making things difficult. I remember sitting very still at the kitchen table while he explained all of this, watching a man I had loved for 35 years describe our entire shared life as though I had been a bystander to it, a helpful but ultimately incidental presence, like good weather during a long drive. I want you to know, he added, almost gently, as if this were a kindness, that I'm not trying to leave you with nothing. But you understand, Linda, you were a homemaker. The business was mine. I built it. I did not cry in front of him. I want that on the record, mostly for myself. I waited until he left for a walk to clear his head, and then I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, and then I called my sister. And then, this is the part that matters, I called an attorney. Ellen Cho was a divorce attorney my sister's friend had used years earlier, in a case that had, my sister told me, gone about as well as these things can go, considering. She specialized, it turned out, in exactly the kind of situation I was in, long marriages where one spouse had built a business, on paper, while the other had in fact been instrumental to it in ways the paperwork never captured. I sat in Ellen's office 3 days later, still slightly numb, and told her everything. The bookkeeping, the supplier negotiations, the location scouting, the client dinners. 35 years laid out across a conference table in fragments, none of it, I assumed, worth very much because none of it had ever had my name on it. Ellen listened to all of it without interrupting, taking notes in a small, careful hand. When I finished, she set her pen down and said something I have thought about many times since. Linda, I want you to understand something clearly. The law in this state doesn't care whether your name was on a paycheck. In a 35-year marriage, courts recognize what's called marital contribution, and that includes non-financial contribution to a spouse's business, especially when that contribution is substantial and demonstrable. What you're describing isn't homemaking in the narrow sense your husband is trying to sell. What you're describing is co-founding a business informally, for decades without title or salary. That's not nothing. That's potentially half of everything. Don't have proof of any of it, I said. It's not like I kept records, it was just my life. Ellen smiled, the particular smile of a professional who has heard this exact fear from 100 clients before. Let's find out what you do have, she said. People who did what you did for 35 years almost always kept more than they think. I spent the next month going through boxes I hadn't opened in years, filing cabinets in the garage. An old desktop computer Robert had replaced a decade earlier and never bothered to wipe. Storage units full of paperwork from the early years of the business that no one had thought to discard, because no one had ever imagined they'd matter. What I found astonished even me. I found the original ledgers from Whitfield Hardware's first 8 years, handwritten, in my own handwriting, documenting every transaction, every vendor negotiation, every decision that had kept that first tiny storefront afloat during years when Robert himself later admitted. In old interviews I found archived from a regional business magazine that we nearly didn't make it those first 2 years. I found emails, going back over a decade, in which I negotiated directly with suppliers on the company's behalf, my name on the letterhead as operations consultant. A title Robert had given me informally, years ago, for exactly these communications, apparently forgetting or hopping I'd forgotten that it existed in writing. I found the site analysis I'd done for the 3rd location expansion, an actual spreadsheet, dated, with my initials in the footer, correctly predicting the profitability timeline that Robert had later taken sole credit for in that same regional business magazine profile, where he described trusting his gut on the location decision without once mentioning that his gut had, in fact, been my spreadsheet. I found 17 years of tax returns I'd personally prepared, filed under both our names, in which the business's growth trajectory tracked precisely alongside years when I could document, through calendars, emails, and old planner notebooks, exactly how many hours I'd spent on bookkeeping, vendor relations, and financial planning. Unpaid, undocumented as employment, but very, very real. I found photographs from a decade of client dinners I'd hosted, menus I'd planned, notes I'd kept on partners' preferences and family details, the quiet infrastructure of relationship management that had kept Whitfield Hardware's key partnerships intact through 3 different economic downturns. None of it had my name on a paycheck. All of it had my fingerprints on it, undeniably, decades deep. I brought 4 full boxes to Ellen's office. She went through them for nearly 2 weeks with a forensic accountant she brought in specifically for the case, and when they finished, Ellen called me into her office and said, "Linda, I want you to sit down for this." The forensic accountant's report, when it was finally compiled, didn't just argue that I'd contributed to the business informally. It quantified it, comparing the market rate for the roles I'd performed: bookkeeper, operations consultant, site analyst, client relations manager, across 35 years, factoring in the demonstrable financial impact of specific decisions I'd made. The supplier renegotiation alone was calculated to have saved the company an estimated $2.3 million over a decade. And building a case that my informal, undocumented role had been, in financial terms, worth easily as much as any salaried executive Robert had ever hired, combined with the straightforward marital property laws already covering our 35 years together, Ellen's assessment was direct. I wasn't entitled to a fair settlement in the diminished sense Robert had originally proposed. I was entitled to close to half of a $42 million business, built in every meaningful sense by both of us. "He's going to fight this," Ellen warned me. Men like Robert usually do, at first. But once his own attorney sees this documentation, I suspect that fight won't last long. This isn't ambiguous. This is 35 years of paper trail he apparently forgot existed. Mediation took place 4 months later, in a conference room not unlike the one I'd sat in with Ellen the first time, Robert on one side with his attorney, a sharp, expensive man named Foster who had clearly been told, before this meeting, that this would be straightforward. Denise was not present, which I appreciated, though I suspect it was strategic rather than considerate. Robert looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was simply seeing him clearly for the first time in years. He greeted me with a stiff, uncertain nod, the posture of a man who has been told something in the last 24 hours that has fundamentally reordered his expectations for this meeting. Ellen walked through the documentation methodically. The ledgers, the emails, the site analysis, the tax records, the forensic accountant's valuation, laying each piece on the table with the same calm, unhurried precision Robert himself had once used to inform me I'd never contributed anything. I watched Foster's expression shift, page by page, from confident to careful too. By the time Ellen reached the supplier renegotiation numbers, something closer to alarm. I watched him lean over and whisper something to Robert. And I watched Robert's face do a series of things I recognized from 35 years of marriage, the particular flush that meant he was embarrassed, followed by the tightness around his jaw that meant he knew he was caught and hated it. "This is," Foster cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield, I'd like to request a brief recess." They took 40 minutes. When they returned, the number on the table had changed considerably from the fair proposal Robert had described in our kitchen months earlier. Before we finalized anything, Robert asked to speak with me privately for a few minutes. Not customary, Ellen told me, but not forbidden either, and I agreed, mostly out of curiosity about what a man says after discovering that 35 years of being underestimated had left a paper trail he never saw coming. We sat in a smaller side room, just the two of us, for the first time since the divorce process had begun. "I didn't know," Robert said finally. "About the ledgers. The site analysis. I mean, I knew you did things, Linda. I don't think I understood how much of it actually mattered. I told myself a story, I think. That I built it. That it was mine. You built plenty of it, I said, and I meant it. I wasn't interested in erasing his contributions the way he'd tried to erase mine. But you didn't build it alone. You never did. I don't think you ever really let yourself see that because it was easier not to. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said finally, and it was the first time in the entire process he'd said it plainly without qualification. For the kitchen, for what I said. I don't think I meant it exactly. I think I was looking for a reason to feel less guilty about Denise, and that was the easiest one available. I appreciated the honesty, even that late, even after everything. I didn't forgive him entirely. Some things don't need forgiveness so much as they need distance, but I appreciated it. I built a life too, Robert, I said. It just never had my name on the paperwork. That doesn't mean it wasn't real. Epilogue, the final settlement gave me 44% of Whitfield Hardware's total valuation, along with the house, which Robert didn't contest. I used a portion of it to do something I'd wanted to do for over a decade, and never had the freedom, or frankly the confidence, to pursue. I opened a small consulting firm, helping family-owned businesses formalize exactly the kind of informal roles that had nearly cost me everything. Spouses, adult children, and partners doing genuine operational work without title, salary, or paper trail. Invisible on the books, and therefore invisible in the eyes of the law when things eventually fell apart. My youngest son, Daniel, joined me 2 years later, after finishing his MBA. Together, we've helped over 60 families formalize roles like mine, put names on the paperwork before crisis makes it necessary, protect the quiet architects of family businesses who too often go unrecognized until it's almost too late. Robert and Denise married 18 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that Denise has taken an increasingly visible operational role at the company, and, with something that might be irony or might simply be poetic justice, that Robert insisted, this time, on putting her name formally on the payroll from the very beginning. I like to think some part of him learned something, even if it took losing half of everything to teach it to him. As for me, I kept the ledgers. All 4 boxes of them, 35 years of quiet, undocumented, absolutely essential work, now sitting in a cabinet in my new office, a reminder I don't actually need anymore but keep anyway. Proof, in my own handwriting, of a truth I had always known and had simply, finally been given the chance to prove. I was never just a housewife. I was the woman who built half of everything, whether or not anyone ever thought to write my name on it. The end.